My name is Terry Eikenberry, and I'm the Kuali Ready Product Manager. So glad you could all join us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Megan Levy from the University of Washington. Megan has a decade of experience building partnerships to improve the resiliency of organizations in the regional economy through her work with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, and also at Microsoft, where she focused on global compliance for cloud services and aligned business continuity and program management with data-driven planning. Today, Megan is an Associate Business Continuity Planner, Master of Infrastructure Planning and Management, and currently works as the Business, Academic, and Research Continuity Manager at the University of Washington. She's based in the university's Emergency Management Department. I also happen to know that Megan loves to hike and has scaled some pretty fascinating mountains up there in Washington. Welcome, Megan. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you joining me today to hear about how we at the University of Washington have been using Kuali Ready. We call it HUSKY Ready, and what we've done to kind of build out the system to support our teams when we direct them to this program. I won't read you my agenda, but that's kind of what I'm hoping to run through. So next slide. As a bit of a scene setter, I want to explain a little bit about the University of Washington and who we are. We're an urban campus based in the city of Seattle, just north of downtown, but we also have two other campuses. So our Tacoma campus is about 35 miles south of us. Our Bothell campus is about 17 miles north. And we also have UW Medicine, which is both our medical school and a large medical provider in the region. We own and operate UW Medical Center, and we provide staff and services to the region's only level 1 trauma center, which is Harborview Medical Center. That's a county hospital, but all the staff who work there are actually UW employees. As a university, we have 56,000 students. As an employer, we have 25,000 employees, which actually makes us the 4th largest employer in the state of Washington, kind of on par with Amazon. We're a major research institution as well. We were recently ranked number 10 in the US News and World Report's Best Global Universities rankings, which is based largely on research prowess. And we bring in about 1.3 to 1.6 billion in research grants every year. Next slide. So obviously, continuity of operations as an employer, as a place of education, and as a research institution are all like major focuses for us as a university. And in 2007, that led to the creation of our administrative policy statement 13.2, which calls on every department across the University of Washington, so including our campuses in Bothell and Tacoma, including all of our research sites and auxiliary sites across the world, actually, to have continuity of operations plans. The only thing that the APS submitted was the medical center itself. So UW Medicine as an educational institution, UW Medicine as a support for the hospitals, including the UW Medicine IT or the billing, those all fall under our APS, but the medical center itself as a regional hospital falls under greater state and federal law, and therefore I luckily don't have to support their continuity planning as well. We also under state law are required to have, as a state institution, a continuity of operations plan. Our UW COOP is new. It was first submitted to the state at the end of 2017, and we're in our first ever revision. But based on the APS, we repeatedly point the responsibility back down into the individual units. So our APS calls on every unit to have a prioritized list of critical functions, an alternative staffing plan that accounts for a 25% reduction in staff, and that is very much reflective of the fact that we were experiencing a lot of major flus around the time that this was first created as an APS, and then its revision in 2009 when there was the H1N1 outbreak. Every unit has to identify an alternative facility by name, which is a little bit tricky for folks because they're looking at a campus that's constantly changing and saying, if something happens, we're going to move to this exact site. And then they're required to do staff preparedness training. These plans, once they're created, need to be reviewed annually and exercised every other year with UW Emergency Management. Essentially, what this says is that we're never going to be taking a centralized approach at the University of Washington. We've really identified that as an incredibly decentralized institution where things are very much managed department by department, that while there might be some instruction that comes down from on high about when we'd like to get back to teaching or operations, how that's going to be done is really going to be given to the departments themselves. Next slide. So how are we doing with this at the University of Washington? Well, so far, okay. I'll show that we've had a lot of growth and that we have really used our HUSKY Ready system and the support systems that I've built around it to kind of relaunch our program in the last year. But as you can see, there's still an opportunity to do a lot of growing. We've identified 734 total units. That's always a little bit of a flex number for us, as units sometimes combine into one plan or realize that their work is so complex it needs to be broken out into multiple different plans. The three metrics we're really looking at, though, are: has a department launched a plan at all in our system, which indicates to us that there's an awareness of the requirement, that people have an awareness that HUSKY Ready exists, and that there's at least someone in that department who has some willingness to work on this project. We also look at whether our existing plans are up to date and have been updated in the past year, and whether the plans are complete or compliant, so reviewed annually, exercised on that biennium. And we very much recognize that there's no such thing as a complete continuity of operations plan, because if you say, great, I wrote this plan, and stick it in a binder and put it on a shelf, it's immediately obsolete. So we're hoping that people are getting into the process of building continuity into their onboarding and offboarding, and recognizing that when their operations change, their plan needs to change as well. Next slide. So what do we have to do this with at UW? We have, sadly, more than a lot of universities have. We have our system, HUSKY Ready, and we have one full-time employee. That and having the administrative policy statement that directs people to do continuity planning it feels like very little when you're doing it day to day, but it actually is a lot more than some institutions have given their teams to work with. Next slide. When I first started, we already were using HUSKY Ready as an institution. And so I already had this tool available to me, but I didn't know yet how well it was working for our teams. When I came on, we had about 120 plans in the system, and we were trying to figure out, what actually is working for teams and what's not when they're logging in. The first thing I did was start to explore what was already in there, and we had many plans started, but very few of them were complete. And most of the plans that were started had completed only kind of the first page, the what do you know about your own organization? How many employees are there? What is it that you do? Who's the head of your organization? The kind of things that you could answer in about 5 minutes about the organization you work for, but that wouldn't inform any of your decision making really after a disaster, except to know who the first person you probably call is. Essentially, people had done the easy stuff and then had gone on to trying to address the more business continuity of operations piece of it, realized it was really hard, realized they didn't really know what they were doing, and wandered away. So based on kind of this assessment, just on seeing where our plans had gotten, I sent out a stakeholder survey to everyone who was registered in the system, just to get a sense of what about Ready was working for them, what about Ready wasn't working for them, and hopefully in identifying the gaps, I was hoping could move everybody forward. What we found was that the system was working for people. People felt that it asked good questions. They liked that everything was captured in a single location. Those who knew that this was how it was set up, appreciated that it was kept outside of our IT infrastructure, which, though it sometimes is annoying to people that they're creating a different login and password instead of going to our UW login page, means that for those who are aware of what our network looks like, which, though robust, everything that goes through the network requires the network, saw that as long as we have internet, we can access our Ready plans regardless of what's happening at the University of Washington. As a whole, our leadership liked that it was affordable and that we had unlimited users so that everyone who needed to have access to the plan could have access. Most of the cons I found weren't about the system itself. It was about business continuity. Teams did not understand the point or concept of continuity planning. So they got in, they would maybe answer some of the questions and how to cope about their critical functions, but they weren't writing processes. They found that it was really time consuming, and since they didn't always understand what they were asking, they felt they were being asked the same questions over and over again. And then they really didn't know even what they were supposed to do with it. They were pointed to a system, told to go ahead and make a plan, but not sure what they were supposed to do with that plan once they felt it was created. So more than anything, the system helped me understand that our system could be as basic or as robust as possible, and it wouldn't matter. If we were just throwing people into the program, quoting an administrative policy statement at them, and moving on to the next group, hoping that those people in our wake would log in and develop their plans. Next slide. Complicating this is that we had no idea really what the scope of the business continuity position at the UW was. We didn't have a list of departments. We didn't have a sense of that 120 plans that were in place. Did that reflect 75% of the university, or did it reflect 5% of the university? Additionally, we've been losing staff positions at UW Emergency Management and have experienced a number of hiring freezes over the years. And so that has included losing a position in September of this year, which was our seismic resilience manager who did all of our personal preparedness outreach and training. And since that's part of our continuity planning requirements, that's kind of an extra complicating factor. Additionally, we lack leadership support. There hasn't been a continuity culture at the University of Washington, and there hasn't been a significant push to build continuity U-wide from a leadership perspective. So obviously myself, my predecessor, there's been a push up through UW Emergency Management to go to people and say, hey, continuity planning is required and it's important, and it's a key part of us remaining the research and education and employing institution that we are. But that has really meant that if we win over hearts and minds, then great, and that department will move forward. And if they're not hearing it from their director for some departments, that's going to be a stop sign that keeps us from moving forward. All right, next slide. So the first thing I did last September when I came on was explore how the system was working for us, and then start to try to build the program structure behind it that would mean that we weren't just abandoning people with a computer program saying, have at it, do continuity planning, but actually giving them a sense of what it would mean to get from launching a plan to where they were actually in compliance and were able to move into just an annual cycle of revision, testing, and addressing gaps, and kind of deepening and strengthening their plan with each go around. So the first thing was providing program structure. There was a lot of confusion about what constituted a plan, what it should complete, whether people were on their own with it, whether it would be reviewed by UW Emergency Management, how they could tell their bosses they were done, how I could tell their bosses they weren't done yet. And essentially all the building blocks were in our APS, but it wasn't spelled out in a way for anyone to actually understand what it meant about where they were in the process. So the structure you see here is just trying to visualize for folks what it means for them to create a plan and move through the cycle. The writing and revising the plan piece is the biggest piece of this. This is the big lift that is people creating their continuity of operations plans for the very first time. But moving into the cycle, reviewing the plan, exercising every other year, identifying gaps and addressing with action items. This is the piece that once they get past initial compliance, this will take very little of their time, except if large portions of their operations change, which in a university environment can sometimes not happen for 2 decades and then suddenly change wildly. But for the most part, we're asking for a large lift up front and then minor maintenance throughout. Next slide. The other piece of providing program structure was getting a sense of our scope and our numbers and trying to identify whether we were doing well or not at it so far. And what I learned once I started here was that we were a very decentralized organization. And that meant that when I asked, great, so the APS says that every unit needs to have a plan, how many units are there? People just laughed at me. If I asked for a list of departments, people just said, oh yeah, wouldn't that be nice? So I set about creating the data that would tell us how we were doing. And that really meant clicking through every org chart that exists at this university and trying from that to get the best sense possible of how many departments existed. I was then able to create a campus by campus comparison of our numbers and say, this is how we're doing across campuses, to compare our academic, business, and research departments to one another, and really to get a sense of whether plans were moving. All of this really just allowed for us to own our bad numbers and know whether we were making any progress or not and show our program growth. And more than anything, my hope is long-term that it's going to give us the opportunity to kind of breed competition and tip the scales towards shame a bit when it comes to getting people to have a sense of where we are as a university and where they hold up against the university as a whole. Next slide. Additionally, I recognize that people who don't know what business continuity is have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. And this is seen in a lot of ways. When I approach teams, I often find that they go one of 2 ways. They either say, oh, well, we run into situations like this all the time and we've always figured them out. Or they say, if the earthquake is as bad as they say it is, because that is our biggest risk here in Seattle, is the big Cascadia destructive earthquake. If it's as bad as they say it's going to be, then none of this is going to be here anyway, and it doesn't matter. And I always caution our teams not to go to the absolute worst case scenario first, because you're immediately shutting down your ability to do any of this thinking. Because yeah, if it's as bad as they say it is, who knows what our situation is going to be. But most continuity of operations situations people run into are not the worst possible earthquake out there. They're minor incidents that end up setting off weeks or months worth of issues. So they are fires and pipe breaks and construction workers digging up your fiber optic cable so that you don't have internet for quite a while. So one of the things that I built was Build Your Plan in a Year. It's a pilot that we've been trying out. It's completely hands-off on my part. I develop monthly tasks that I post on our website that have clear time commitment. So I say from the top, hey, I think this month is going to take you 2 hours, 4 hours. I think the biggest one is 6 hours over the course of the month. And if you have any questions, go ahead and reach out to me. But here's the step-by-step process for moving through this section. And I take a section of our HUSKY Ready plan and I say, this month we're going to focus on employees and staff, and we're going to answer all the questions about employees and staff. This month we're going to start doing critical functions. And the critical function piece and how to cope is obviously the biggest, most important piece of what we're trying to capture from our plans. Is what is it that you do that really cannot pause, or that can pause but needs to be brought up, if not in the best way possible, but in a quick, dirty way that gets it done, so that we can continue to move our operations forward over the course of figuring out where we are as an organization after an event and moving into the recovery stages. And through Build Your Plan in a Year, I get the opportunity to give people descriptions about what it is we're looking for, explain to them what each section is asking of them, so that they're not just going into the system seeing questions like, can you do this without your network? Well, if you're just an everyday non-business continuity person and somebody says, can you do your job without the network? You either say no, or yes, or sure, we'll move to paper. But if you're a business continuity person, you're really asking, can you do this without the network? What does that look like? Does that paper already exist? Who's been trained in it? Where are they going to find that documentation and start to run with it? And that allows me to, before they even do their continuity of operations plan, as they move through the Build Your Plan in a Year system, they get that description from me ahead of time that says, hey, I'm looking for a process here, not an answer to a question. Next slide. And I've also done a lot of hand-holding. So one of the goals with Build Your Plan in a Year was to have this online available tool to them where people could self-launch and they would have a way of moving through it on our website. But one of the things I've learned about the University of Washington as a culture, especially as they are not deeply familiar with continuity of operations, is they like to do things in person. People like to see you and put a face to the name and hear from you about why it's important. I've had many people say that the number of examples I can give, the passion I have for it, really helps them to kind of see things from my viewpoint as they work through the system. And a lot of that means getting myself in front of as many teams as possible. And more than ever, that means that building tools on our website, having things like Build Your Plan in a Year, developing flyers that streamline my pitch about what the program is so that I can actually dive into presenting them with more in-depth ways of looking at their planning. All of these allow people to kind of, one, get a sense of what it is we're trying to accomplish with continuity of operations at the university, and I think feel that if they want to stop seeing me hanging out and showing up at things, that they're going to have to start actually doing this work. Next slide. And then lastly, what I did to kind of build out the structure and make people feel like there was an actual point and end to this process was to formalize the review and exercise process. So that means that the first time people go through their plan, we really want them to submit it to UW Emergency Management for review. It allows me to check, hey, are they meeting all the requirements of our administrative policy statement? So can I actually say this is a compliant plan? But is this a compliant plan is really only the first 5 questions of a 4-page review. It's an opportunity for me to read through their plan and see how they've interpreted the system and educate them on how they can turn things into continuity of operations while checking on their compliance. So I get to share industry best practices. All of my comments are tied to the exact section and page in the HUSKY Ready plan the team should be addressing. And it's really just an opportunity to say, great, I'm glad that you answered this question, but this is what I would be looking for if we were turning it into a process. My comments on their how to cope, on whether they've done in-depth continuity thinking, this does not prevent them from kind of getting to that compliance check mark. It's not going to have me telling their directors, oh yeah, no, they haven't addressed everything I wanted them to, so why don't we like keep working on this forever until I tell them like, yeah, good job. If they're in compliance with the APS, then everything I say to them is, these are the kind of things we're going to look at over the next year of review, over the next 2 years before your next exercise. To get to the initial compliance, they also need to have an exercise. And really that's a process that grows on itself. So the first time through, we do a facilitated read through. Usually these plans are being written by a single administrator in the organization, or they're passing it off onto a student intern and saying, hey, interview everybody, develop this plan. And they're doing an amazing job of collecting all the information and giving us good data based on their interviews. But then when you sit people down in a room together and the person actually required to implement that section of a plan sees how it's written, they sometimes say, oh, hold up, that actually doesn't make sense for how we do things here, or that wouldn't address all of the ways that we have legal, regulatory, other responsibilities to the university, and they're able to kind of adjust things on the fly. People are extremely good at editing, and this is an opportunity for them to sit in a room together and edit. Future exercises, we'll be looking at 2 years down the road from the first one, a tabletop exercise that actually takes the scenario, pushes the plan up against it, and says, your plan said you were going to do things this way, but your decision making in this room said you're going to do it this other way. What makes more sense, and what should be actually written in the plan? And then lastly, we'll be moving towards those interdependencies between departments. So our goal is not over and over again to have departments just test their plan in a silo with one another, but it's really to start to have all the payroll teams exercise together with our central payroll, to have all the facility services teams exercise together to ensure that they're able to support one another's critical functions, regardless of kind of who is able to show up on campus after an event happens. And then lastly, I created a self-review checklist. And this really just provides the assurance that the plan was actually reviewed each year. So in the HUSKY Ready system, anytime somebody makes an edit, well, that was the last edit date. But I want to ensure that at least once a year, I'm checking in with teams, reminding them that I exist, reminding them the plan exists, and giving them the opportunity to kind of go through a checklist to make sure that they're still in compliance, that everything that's in the system is still true to how they do things as an organization. So it's been a year since I started, and really 2018 has been the push of building the system out and doing things in a different way than we've done before. And we have some lessons learned so far, and we have a ways to go still. One of the biggest things is, I think we're often told in the business continuity world that you can't do anything unless you have full leadership buy-in. And buy-in is amazing. It's great to have. It's hard to come by. And I've gotten a chance over the last year to see what it's like to work with buy-in and to work without it. So I've been very lucky in that our executive vice president for finance and administration, who started shortly before I did, came from the private sector and was very numbers driven the same way I am. And so when I was able to present him with our data, he immediately said, I want at least every team under me, which is 42 of our departments, to have these plans in place. And he set a goal for them to have them in place by the end of our fiscal year. So by June of next year. And he made the ask to his departments and sent them to me. And I've been able to do things like sit down with all the teams under finance to do this planning together, where I check in with them every month and they bring their questions to me and they're sharing with their peers where they're running into issues and where they're seeing successes and how they've approached different questions. But it's also been an opportunity for us to compare it to what it's like going through without leadership support. So while my EVP for finance and administration obviously is over all of our finance and administration departments, that doesn't move us forward in academic departments. It doesn't move us forward at the other university campuses. It isn't something that kind of can leverage our research teams. And so I've seen that without leadership support, you're often working with people who have bought into what it is you have to say, and that they themselves sometimes drive the planning for their own departments. And so, yeah, it's very good if you can get people from on high to say, hey, this is really important. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to do it. And sometimes just having the teams themselves say for themselves that it's important and sit down and do the work, since you're always going to be depending on them to actually provide you with the information, when it comes organically from the organization itself, they're sometimes more passionate and willing to do a thorough job on it than if it's just another assigned thing from on top. I've also found that the scope of this, and really any institution of higher learning, it's large. It may not be UW huge because we've really set ourselves up to have quite an extensive number of plans, but you're always going to need to set priorities. And obviously you might be aiming towards having all your life safety teams and all your teams in charge of things like payroll and managing people to ensure that you actually have staff on campus. And those might be your priorities, but they won't necessarily be the people who want to do this planning. And while I will never stop pushing against the things that are the most important for us as a university to figure out, I also found that there's no reason not to go after the easy triumphs. If a department is interested in doing this planning, it is worth giving them the time, even if you think, well, in the grand scheme of things, this department's not that important to the university as a whole. It's not a critical department for us, because every time I go through this process with folks, I have the opportunity to explain better what it is we're looking for, have a sense of how people interpret the system, become better at promoting it to folks. And I have yet another example for people to look at about what this actually means for them. I find that people love to edit, they hate to create, and they love to see what other people have done. And so one of my main goals has been turning UW Emergency Management's plan in Husky Ready into a model for other teams. And any team that wants to have access to it, I give them view access. And I give them the opportunity to see it in Husky Ready. So I don't just pull out the PDF and email it to them, but I actually let them click through our plan in Ready and see, okay, so when this section's asking this, these are the kinds of details that they gave. And as much as possible where it makes sense, I will give people boilerplate language or kind of spell out for them, like, this is what a non-network version of your process might look like. This is what a version of your process with 50% staff might look like, so that they have the opportunity to kind of cross things out, say that it makes no sense, scoff at me about how I don't know anything about their department, and make the edits. And I am perfectly comfortable with being wrong if it means that I move people forward. It's really important with continuity of operations not to assume that people know what you're talking about, to be ready and open to doing the education piece of that. That's what I mean when I say meet your units at their knowledge level, not your own. You might understand continuity of operations deeply. You might understand the organization as a whole better than any single unit does, but it's important to meet them where their knowledge level is and allow them to ask questions and allow them to kind of build their knowledge around continuity of operations. And that may mean that you are answering the same questions over and over again because you're working with different teams about what this really means for them and how severely they should be planning. And, you know, everything that you suggest, they'll be like, well, that just won't work because everything's gone. But helping like reel them in. And then everything you implement should decrease the barrier to entry. So the hope is with everything I implement, by putting a system behind, or a process behind our actual system, by giving them tools online, moving forward, maybe creating videos about how to move through the system, all of it should mean that the place where a person says, this is too hard, I don't know understand what it is I'm supposed to be doing, gets further and further down the road. So there's always a resource right there that helps push them that little bit further, because the deeper people are into something before they hit a roadblock, the more likely they are to try to get around that roadblock, because they can't help but look back on the time they've invested so far and say, I don't want that to have been time wasted. And then lastly, and this really goes along with finding your easy triumphs, but don't be afraid to walk away from a group and try again later. I've gone in front of teams and had them argue with me about why this is important, argue with me about the way our administrative policy statement is written and the way the university is approaching continuity of operations. tell me that it doesn't make any sense or it's a bad way of doing things, to which I sort of like, I understand where they're coming from. I, as the person who has to get people compliant with the APS, to an extent sort of shrug and say, but it's the law and it's our policy and we've got to do it whether it makes sense to you or not. But it's also meant that sometimes I say, look, I have over 700 of these to do. And if you don't want to be one of the people doing it right now, that's okay. I'm going to walk away. I'll come back again later. And I've had teams invite me back months after they told me that there was no way they were going to be doing this, to say, we've talked about it more. We've explored the resources you sent us. I think we get it a little bit better. And we sort of start again from scratch, but with a better viewpoint from my audience. Next slide. And we're seeing growth. For the longest time, our system was essentially sitting fallow. We launched it in 2011. We had a staff member dedicated to it until 2015, and then he left University of Washington, and they didn't fill the position until the end of 2017. And in that time, we had nobody actually get to the completed plan stage, and it was essentially the system was there and people were going in, and if they knew about it, launching plans, and if they had the energy for it, working through the plan and filling everything out. But since we started taking a more hands-on approach and providing people with more resources and getting out in front of people more, we've seen a major growth in the number of plans being launched in the system. And also we've seen 700% since we started at zero, growth in the number of plans complete. And we have a lot actually that are working through the process now, and we should see completed by the end of the fiscal year. So it's not that people are unwilling to do this work, but when you just kind of set them on the system by themselves and they're left to figure out what continuity of operations is and decide from there what it is they hope to accomplish, that's asking a lot from teams that usually this is something that they're doing in addition to their everyday tasks, in addition to many other required administrative functions they have at the university. And so by making it as easy for people as possible, we are seeing this, the system itself is growing, and in the process, we're having better and more robust and actually completed plans here at the university. Next slide. So now we're looking at what's next. This will be year 2 we're moving into in 2019. And one of the biggest things I'm finding is that I'm just one person and I'm running into capacity issues. I cannot be as hands-on for teams if I really hope to accomplish getting all 700 plus departments into our system and moving along with their planning process. And it also, right now, we're seeing that because it's so hands-on, because I have so few good online resources outside of Build Your Plan in a Year, that teams are really having to wait until I have availability to come to them before they can get started and launching in the system. And so in the next year, my goals are to finish out Build Your Plan in a Year pilot. That should be done by December. And then expand that offering. So go through with the teams that have been piloting it, get their input, clean everything up to make sure that with a year's perspective back on it, I think I'm explaining things as well as I can be, and start to move them into training videos and pieces of information that people can use that kind of better inform them as they move through, and that make it feel like I'm sitting there with them as they move through the process. Additionally, we will be emphasizing group work. That's something that I've really taken out of my work with the finance department, is that when people get to talk to their peers about this, especially when they all work in similar departments that touch each other every day, that are going to be very dependent on one another to do everyday operations, let alone continuity of operations, that it really helps people to hear where others are running into trouble. If they're behind everybody else, they get new perspective. And if they're ahead of everyone else, they get to share information and hear people's questions about the system and answer them for themselves in the context of their own organization. So as the business continuity manager looking at over 700 plus departments, I don't have in-depth knowledge on any one. And so by doing this planning with their peers, they get the opportunity to have quite in-depth knowledge and share from a more knowledgeable perspective. And then we'll be taking a new approach to research. So initially the idea was that just like everyone else, our research teams would launch plans in our system, go through the process, and have their plans completed. And that works for our standing research teams. So for example, our primate research center, it's always going to be there. They are a department just like any other department. They do animal care, but that's just a portion of what they do. It makes sense for them to go through the Kuali Ready, HUSKY Ready system. However, for research teams that have applied for a grant, applied to do their work at the University of Washington, will come here, do their research, develop whatever product they have at the end of it, and then turn that into the next round of funding requests and the next bit of research that's done either here at UW or at some other university. It doesn't work for you to wait until they've gotten to the university and they're trying to get ready for that work, and then you say, great, if you could write this continuity of operations plan that tells me how you're going to not lose your research product. They just sort of laugh at you and say, look, I only have so much time to do this. Like, why would I spend any time on that? And so one of the things we're looking at in 2019 is moving the continuity of operations question into the application to do research at the University of Washington. So when they apply to work here and they answer all the questions about what their resource needs are and what the goals of the research project are and what their relationship to the University of Washington will be, we also want to ask them about what they're doing to protect the property. So the specimens, the intellectual property that's coming out of it, the data, and get those questions answered before they ever even start a project so that we're not interrupting their work to say, hey, we don't want you to lose this information. It's something that's already been established before they even start the process here. Next slide. And that's all I knew I wanted to say to you, but if there are any questions.
Megan, thanks so much for sharing your experiences there and implementing and your successful business continuity program at UW. I think I can speak for everyone today in saying that we've definitely learned something new. For the attendees, we've received some questions, but please take this opportunity to submit any more that you might have. You can do that by hovering over the bottom of your webinar window and clicking on the chat button. So go ahead and do that now. And Megan, I'm going to read to you a couple of the questions that we've received so far. You mentioned that your campus has to be trained regularly. Was that mandated in the university's APS? And how did you get buy-in for the time that you would spend with that regular training?
So yes, everybody has to do personal preparedness training, and it is required for whatever reason in our continuity of operations APS and not the emergency management one. We are still addressing what that looks like for people. So because we lost our outreach coordinator, when she was still here, it was great. She did regular talks. I just pointed people to it. They told me how their teams were doing on getting personal preparedness training, and I was very hands-off. However, since losing her position, we've had to kind of reel back and say, this is required for folks. We have to make it available to them, but it's also not any one person's particular responsibility. And so what that's meant is that I've been using more of a train the trainer model. So we monthly do a personal preparedness training at UW Emergency Management that's geared towards the expectation that people will come, learn about it, take the slides, and bring it back to their organization. And I can provide them with the printed materials they need, with, you know, little whistles and flashlights to hand out to folks, but I just cannot be in every department. And more, we're also moving towards a model where the established onboarding procedures that exist in every department are now seeing a greater focus on having a personal preparedness presentation in that, because at least then we know we're touching each person as they come in.
Good, thank you. Another question, how in depth do you dive to create a plan for each department? Does each sub-department inside a department, for instance, records inside human resources, get their own plan, or do you create a general human resource plan and break it down inside the plan?
That's a great question. And as far as the requirements of the APS go, I say there just has to be an overarching plan. So the School of Education has to have an overarching plan, and then typically they break it down under that plan within their critical functions. However, if a team comes to me and says, this is so complex, it doesn't make sense for this to be a single plan. For example, our applied physics laboratory, they've launched 22 plans. And so they have one that's specific to doing research funding and one that's specific to maintaining the labs, because they see it as too complex to have any single plan. So I'm really, because our APS just says every department and unit, which leaves us very wildly open to interpretation, I aim for the highest level, recognizing that the workload I'm asking for is large, and then I leave it to the teams to kind of help me self-define for them what actually makes sense in terms of how operations work within the department, and where having everything together would make a plan far too complex to use, or where I've split things across multiple departments because that's how their org chart shows, but they're really teams that are working very closely together and all reporting up through the same structure.
Good, okay. And then you would just link your dependencies within the plan, correct?
Correct.
So another question, do you have any tips on weaving continuity planning into the onboarding and offboarding culture at your institution?
So the greatest success we've had with that has been in facility services, because that's where UW Emergency Management is based. So they really have to put up with me a lot. But it's now become required that every person who onboards as part of the packet of information they get are also reviewing the continuity of operations plan. It's in the onboarding and offboarding checklists now that you go into the continuity of operations plan and ensure that if a person's leaving, that their name is no longer listed there. If a person's coming on and will have a responsibility under the plan, their name gets listed there. And for folks who have kind of greater responsibility under the plan, they sit down with me and review what that means for them. In the future, they'll be sitting down in their own departments because they'll be more familiar with the work and they can talk with one another about their continuity plan. But essentially, they get the quick briefer from me on what continuity of operations is and why we're doing it, and what their responsibilities are under this plan, and kind of moving forward, how they might seek to change it.
Let's see. Do you have to take a different or unique approach when it comes to laboratories, or do you find they can follow the process like any other department?
I find that laboratories can follow the process like any other department when it comes to day-to-day operations. So just maintaining records and doing the support for the teams that use those laboratories. But I also find that labs can't separate themselves from the research that's happening in their laboratory. They take a lot of personal responsibility for it. So while the responsibility of the laboratory might be being open or not being open, having record keeping or not, providing the communication that they need to provide, they find that they get really caught up in like, oh, but this team needs a deep freeze freezer, and if they don't have that, then they're going to lose all their specimens. Technically, that's the responsibility of that team, but that's not how the lab managers see it. And so I've really found that getting them through the process, focused on what are actually solely their responsibilities that they have control over, works a lot better if I also provide them with resources to hand out to their teams. And a lot of that has been like our specimen sharing agreements with other universities and best practices for maintaining research continuity. And then at least I think they feel that they're providing the information, whether the teams run forward with it or not. I think it's an opportunity for them to kind of say, great, and now I don't feel like I'm so responsible for this.
Yeah, that's great. So do your departments typically have difficulty identifying their own critical functions?
At first they do. And I think that really depends more on how resistant they are to the process, because they know their organization. The system makes it very clear to them kind of what timelines we're looking at. So we say, can this pause for 72 2 hours to 2 weeks, or does it absolutely have to be back up within 72 hours? Can you go from 2 weeks to a month? And we kind of assume anything after a month is going to be deferrable. Within a month, if it's something that we really need to be doing, we'll have an opportunity to gain some perspective and look at what the next steps are. Sometimes people have a challenge because they look at the university as a whole and say, well, obviously you're going to be focused on patient care. Obviously we're going to be taking care of students, or we're going to be ensuring that our research animals are in good health. So nothing that we do is as important as that. And that's where I have to kind of refocus people and say, you're not making these decisions for the enterprise as a whole. You're making these decisions for your department, knowing that that's going to be the focus you have when you come on, and that it may be a long time till you get true directive on where you need to be going. And so this isn't about what's most critical for the university as a whole. It is about what's most critical for your department to continue operations. And we always emphasize a focus on not just life safety, because a lot of teams here don't have a life safety responsibility, but retaining employees, maintaining our reputation, ensuring that we're completing our mission as a university to educate students, and all those things that wouldn't be part of your emergency response plan, but as business continuity, you're thinking about whether you're going to get fined, whether it's going to hurt people if you're not doing the work you need to be doing. And as business continuity manager, I've always been especially interested in ensuring that if we hire a lot of minimum wage or low income workers, that we're thinking about how we're going to get people back to work as soon as possible, because that ensures that whatever regional disaster happened doesn't become like a significant personal disaster for them as well.
Good, good. So what are your thoughts on a peer review of the plans? Do you think that could work?
That's a really good question. I find that teams that work closely together really benefit from seeing one another's plans. I don't think that any of them understand the continuity process well enough to critically review one another's plans. The time may come when that's different. We do have a resilience work group at the university that kind of oversees the work I do. I present my numbers. I talk to them about the approaches I want to take. And the goal is with time for them to better understand continuity of operations so that they can do the role of reviewing plans within their own organizations and training people and kind of presenting and helping people get to that continuity mindset. I'm not sure if I ever feel like me as a control freak will fully let go of reviewing the plans for compliance and all that, but it is an opportunity to point people to a peer who's done the work and say they can give you such better perspective on how this is done within your organization, the way your organization runs, than I can coming from an enterprise level.
Okay, how do you use reports or information collected from or within the system during an interruption or event from the perspective of a high-level enterprise risk management?
So when we develop our continuity of operations framework that governs the whole university, I pull the reports from our HUSKY Ready system on what the dependencies are, and I'm kind of using it to help us map overarching, like where people are running into the biggest like barriers. Most of them here are UW-IT and central payroll. Our COOP plan, though, very much focuses on maintaining the president's cabinet and the decision-making that they will be doing, and makes a lot of assumptions that teams will be ready to run with whatever decisions are made from the president's cabinet. And that, again, comes down to the University of Washington as an organization, which is built up very decentralized and is a very old university that looks like a legacy system in a lot of ways. So one department that I think of when I think of that is our environmental health and safety department, which has enterprise-wide responsibility, but used to just do lab safety when they were part of UW Medicine, and as greater and greater responsibilities were required under law, they became more and more, like they got pushed to EH&S over and over again. And that's far apart from any of our other safety and security operations here. So everybody's kind of running their own organizations under our greater organizational umbrella. And so there's never going to be a big centralized plan that says this is what we're doing as an enterprise. It's always going to be, these are our priorities, so focus on those priorities, but we have an expectation that you know how to run your operations.
Great, great. Okay, so folks, we're out of time. We still do have a handful of really great questions here, so we'll try to answer those in an email to you. Megan, again, a huge thank you to you for sharing your time and your information with us today. It was great information. We really appreciate that. Again, the presentation has been recorded. A link will be emailed to everyone. And I do want to say thank you to everyone that is attending today. Thanks for attending the webinar, and everyone, please have a great day.